taking questions right at the end. So if you think of all your wonderful questions, please save them up and put them in the chat at the end, or you can put your hand up in the Teams icon, and then you can speak using your mic if you're unmuted. So now I'm going to introduce our wonderful guest speakers tonight. I'm going to start with Faye Ballard. There she is, she's waving. Faye read History of Art at the University of Sussex and worked at the Royal Academy of Arts and the Tate. She completed her MA Fine Arts at Central St Martin's in 2006. After her father's death in 2009, Faye explored her childhood as a motherless daughter in drawings informed by psychoanalysis. These were exhibited in London and Leeds in solo shows, and recently in 2 collaborative exhibitions with Judy Goldhill, Breathe at the Freud Museum in 2018, and Travelling Companions at the University of Cambridge, which started in 2020 and is still going on because of the pandemic. Faye was a visiting artist at Hammersmith Hospital in 2017 and 2018 and sits on the Imperial Health Arts Committee, delivering arts programmes to patients across 5 London hospitals. Her practice included field trips to record flora growing in specific locations, most recently in Transylvania for the Prince's Foundation. Faye speaks regularly at London art schools. Her work is held by the Queen, the Prince of Wales, the Prince's Foundation, Imperial Health, Royal College of Physicians, Windsor and Newton, and Murray Edwards College in Cambridge. In September, she'll be exhibiting a new body of work called In Circles at Handel Street Projects in London. Now I'm going to introduce Judy Goldhill. Give us a wave, Judy. Artist Judy Goldhill exhibits her photographs and short films, as well as producing artist books, which have been acquired by a major international collections. I hope I'm going to say this right. She won the Burgess Skjold Award, I'm sorry, my pronunciation, terrible, for excellence at the London Artist Book Fair, held at the Whitechapel Art Gallery. All her books were recently acquired by the British Library for their Emerging European Artists collection. And now I'm going to introduce Ellie. Dr. Elizabeth Pimentel de Çetin trained as an economist and is the director of the think tank, the Thread Policy Research Centre. Her work centres on public policy in relation to gender, public finance and the care economy, strategies to combat gender-based violence, sexual and reproductive rights and mediation, peace and reconciliation in conflict zones. Recently, Ellie signed on to the UK Parliament's Knowledge Exchange Unit database as a researcher on COVID-19 and its impact on legally protected classes, focusing on poverty, survival, sex and food insecurity. She is a member of the Policy Advisory Group for the UK Women's Budget Group. Ellie holds advanced degrees in philosophy, public policy and administration and economics. She's basically just got all of the degrees. Her postdoctoral research is on the aesthetics of feminist philosophies. Okay, so like I said, we are all going to be speaking a little bit and we have presentations, so I'm going to share my screen if I can remember how to do it. So bear with me and hopefully technology will be on our side. Oh, it's there. There will be some waiting. I'm sorry about this, everybody. Oh, and apologies if you hear my cat snoring. She's also in the room. Okay, hopefully, Ellie, can you see my slide? Can you give me a thumbs up?
I can.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so I want to start with a quote from Olivia Lang, whose book Funny Weather, Art in an Emergency, considers creative practice and art making not just as an essential mode of living and processing experience, but as a means to help us respond to difficult times and traumatic events. Lang says, we're so often told that art can't really change anything, but I think it can. It shapes our ethical landscapes. It opens us to the interior lives of others. It's a training ground for possibility. It makes plain inequalities and it offers other ways of living. What art does is provide material with which to think, new registers, new spaces. After that, friend, it's up to you. I don't think art has a duty to be beautiful or uplifting, and some of the work I'm most drawn to refuses to traffic in either of those qualities. What I care about more are the ways in which it's concerned with resistance and repair. So these quotes really resonated with me as I turned to writing as a means of processing my thoughts and feelings whenever I'm struggling with anything challenging or painful. Writing is my art making. Even though I'm a PhD student, I find academic writing a bit of a slog, but I've always found creative writing a way to explore my feelings and as a catharsis when I can't get out of the jumble of thoughts in my own head. The process of writing, and specifically writing by hand, helps me to think through the difficult emotions and conflicted thoughts that sometimes feel too much to hold on together in my head, and that can often feel overwhelming. So I've used writing as a coping mechanism, particularly in response to grief, domestic abuse, and difficult family situations. I write in different formats depending on my mood and how I want to express what I'm turning over in my mind. When my dad died of cancer after years of not being able to be part of his life, I wrote a lot of short poems because I could spill out my thoughts into the page and produce a unit or an instance of what I was struggling with in that moment. I wrote about him. I wrote about our fractured relationship and the person that was keeping us apart and causing him harm, and the trauma of those difficult years. The physical act of writing helped me to feel like I was pulling those difficult things out of my head and putting them somewhere else. Once they were down on paper, I could close my notebook and not look at it again if I didn't want to. Because they travelled from my brain through my hand and onto the paper, they were outside of me, and consequently my head felt lighter for it. Similarly, I sometimes use Julia Cameron's mourning pages technique, and for those who are unfamiliar with it, it's just a method of journaling or free writing where you write 3 pages of longhand every morning when you first wake up to basically offload your thoughts onto the page and start the day with a clearer head. So these morning pages are another method of writing that I use purely for the process. I never look at them again. Other times, the act of writing brings up surprises. I recently started writing a piece of flash fiction for a competition where the prompt was about superstitions. Without intending to, the piece ended with a revelation about my infertility struggles. My point here is that sometimes when you sit down to write, you don't know what's going to come out of that process. And as Lang observes, and our speakers here today will attest, creative practice isn't about making a beautiful end product, but the reparative act of the process itself, of spending time in that mode of creativity and finding a way to deal with your own conflicting thoughts and find out what it is you actually think. While my creative practice is a completely separate entity to my PhD research here at Birkbeck, I have found some crossovers and connections. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about my research and how it deals with interrogating experimental writing as a mode of becoming or a manifestation of the subject in process. So the concept of becoming comes from the post-structuralist thinkers Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, who argue that human experience should be rethought as a perpetual becoming that is always in flux and based in the movable singularities of infinitesimal difference, rather than the more traditional philosophical premise that posits being as a static form grounded in knowable and definable terms. While seemingly abstract, Deleuze and Guattari's concept seems to hold a lot of power and potential, particularly when we think about the multiple and mutable influences that affect how we think, behave and act in any given day or moment, and the possible trajectories that these influences could diverge along. Anyone that has suffered grief or trauma knows that it's not a linear experience. Despite that old adage, time is a healer, the lived experience of loss in whatever form that may take is a continual state of flux and can feel like the ground shifting beneath your feet. Cultural expectations of mourning often define a set period of time to grieve and get over it, after which time you're supposed to carry on as you were before, as if you're not living as constantly altered and constantly altering. are a completely different person to who you were before the event of your trauma. As a literature student, and before that, someone who's always enjoyed being immersed in books, I've always thought about how the books I've read and the writing I do myself has shaped the person I am today. I've been intrigued by books that try to capture this idea of a subject in process. Reading can sometimes feel like quite a passive experience, but it's also incredibly immersive and affecting, and therefore reading itself is a form of creative practice. I'm sure a lot of you can relate to that feeling you get when you finish a book and you absolutely reel from the ending, or it's a book you really connected with, or one that stays with you in some way. The affective element of the reading experience is something I'm particularly interested in, and specifically in relation to the experience of encountering experimental literature. My research explores both fiction and non-fiction forms of experimental writing, and the intersection where they merge and blur these boundaries. Now, I know experimental literature can be a contested form. It can be regarded as too difficult, confusing, ambiguous, elitist, reserved only for critics and the academy. So we've got a definition here by David Lodge, who says an experimental novel is one that ostentatiously deviates from the received ways of representing reality, either in narrative organisation or in style, or in both, to heighten or change our perception of that reality. So if we consider literature in general as a form of cultural production and knowledge construction, it both represents reality and human experience, and it also informs our understanding of that reality and experience. In other words, the process of reading contributes to the way that we understand life. As Helen Taylor argues, life stories are defined in a literary way. We identify with fictional figures and sometimes see the passage from childhood through adolescence to work, marriage, motherhood and old age in terms of chapters. A treasured childhood classic or contemporary novel can be central to defining who we are. As writer Belle Mooney puts it, I am surely shaped by everything I have read since childhood, and certainly see my life in general as an enthralling literary work in progress. Experimental literature then might give us a different framework through which to think about our personal experiences of this reality. Experimenting with traditional or realist narratives offers an alternative way of thinking about our lived experience and holds possibilities to challenge and deconstruct it. As Julie Armstrong suggests, a reader's response to experimental fiction is sometimes one of frustration. I've definitely had that. And anger, leading to confusion and disengagement as experimental works subvert expectations. And yet, experimental fiction is more like real life, in that real life is tangled, non-linear, and complex. It refuses to be packaged into simplistic plots. Experimental works make more and new, sometimes baffling demands on the reader. Fundamentally, a reader approaching experimental fiction needs to suspend their autopilot expectations and discover new ways of seeing. So the authors that I'm studying as part of my research use experimentation with form to question and challenge our accepted paradigms of reality. Emma McBride uses modernist techniques to explore how the legacy of sexual abuse plays out through the traumatized body. In Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, she uses fractured syntax and broken language to convey the unraveling of the protagonist's mental and physical health. The text breaks down as an expression of the breakdown of her own psyche. Ali Smith and Maggie Nelson speak directly about troubling contemporary social and political shifts and the effect of these wider changes on the embodied subject. Maggie Nelson's work of auto theory, The Argonauts, is a form of creative non-fiction writing that situates her lived experience of queer family making, transitioning bodies, and real-time reactions to the changing US political landscape, pitched against theoretical paradigms. Ali Smith's Seasonal Quartet is a series of fictional books that reference contemporary events from the Brexit referendum and the murder of MP Jo Cox in 2016 to the Black Lives Matter protests and the current pandemic. Using these real-life occurrences, she interrogates big themes such as racism, xenophobia, what it means to live in a post-truth society, and the importance of art as a medium to respond to and highlight these cultural shifts at the same time that we're living through them. So each of the books in the Seasonal Quartet references forgotten or sidelined female creatives. So we've got pop artist Pauline Boty, sculptor Barbara Hepworth, film director Lorenzo Mazzetti, and visual artist Tacita Dean. Descriptions of their art are strewn throughout these texts, and each book includes an image of their works on the end papers, some of which I've just shown. The hardcover editions are also wrapped in seasonal paintings by David Hockney. The work of these artists is integral to Smith's quartet because they provide alternative viewpoints through which to consider the frameworks we live by. Boty, Smith says, focused on how governing cultural myths are formed and perpetuated by way of images. So Pauline Boty painted images of celebrities as they appear in cultural representations, exposing the lens of the voyeur and the meaning that the gaze applies to them. For Smith, art, like fiction, reminds you to read and view the world as a construct. She says, if you can read the world as a construct, you can ask questions of the construct, and you can suggest ways to change the construct. You understand that things aren't fixed. So what Smith does by peppering her text with these artists and their work is to highlight the possibility that creativity holds if we only bring it into our daily consciousness. She upholds art, creative practice, and creative thinking as central to our everyday lives, rather than an indulgence or reserved for certain types of people. Art and creativity are for everybody. So these experimental texts are just examples of different kinds of writing that respond to trauma, difficult times, and social changes affecting the specificity of the embodied subject. Smith says that art is one of the prime ways we have of opening ourselves and going beyond ourselves. That's what art is. It's the product of the human being in the world and imagination all coming together. So I want to finish up with this quote from Olivia Laing again, because it perfectly expresses, I think, the sense of overwhelming intensity that has been living through the past year and a half for many of us, and how turning towards art can help to reconfigure a new framework for making sense of the ever-changing socio-political situations we find ourselves in, and finding meaning in increasingly troubled times. Laing says, frankly, the news was making me crazy. It was happening at such a rate that thinking, the act of making sense, felt permanently bogged. Every crisis, every catastrophe, every threat of nuclear war was instantly overridden by the next. There was no possibility of passing through coherent stages of emotion, let alone thinking about responses or alternatives. It seemed as if people were stuck in a spin cycle of terrified paranoia. What I wanted most, apart from a different timeline, was a different kind of intense emotional impact of the. Sorry, I messed up. It was a different kind of time frame in which it might be possible both to feel and to think, to process the intense emotional impact of the news and to consider how we react, perhaps even to imagine other ways of being. So the stopped time of a painting, or the drawn out minutes and compressed years of a novel, in which it's possible to see patterns and consequences that are otherwise invisible. I really like that. I thought that was fantastic. So I have my final slide are some prompts, some writing prompts, and these are ones that I use. So like I said, my creative practice is completely separate from my PhD. These are just things that I do and I find helpful when I'm struggling with something. And sometimes if you want to find a way of responding to something that you are struggling with, I find that picking something like one of these is a way of getting going. You can start by just getting the pen on the paper. So I often write from art. Like now, art galleries are opening again. Yay! So we can go back and walk around them. Or there's plenty of art online, and that always brings up things for me that I wasn't expecting. So I will start writing about a piece of art, and it will turn into something I don't know where that came from. So I find that a really useful prompt to start with. And the morning pages journaling is also really good. And again, you don't have to look at them again. I never look at them again. Or the following first lines that I've put there, things that you're angry about, that you're frustrated about, just write it down. And then that act of writing it just helps to get it outside you and make you feel a whole lot calmer. So those are my prompts. I mean, we can talk about them again at the end in the discussion. So that is the end of my presentation. I will stop sharing now, and I will hand over to Faye. So Faye has some beautiful images to show you, and because we want to give you high quality images, it might take a few minutes to upload because they're big images. So you must bear with us while we get that presentation uploaded. And like I say, think of questions for us or comments so that you can ask us at the end. Excellent. We can see it now, Faye.
Thanks, Carly. Great to be here. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in, as it were. I'm with Judy next to me. There she goes. So I'm going to talk about my own work, my drawings. And I'm starting with a cabbage leaf. Oh, no, I'm not. I am starting with a cabbage leaf. Can everyone see that large? Good. Excellent. Okay. So before my father died, I was obsessed with making plant drawings. And this is one example, a cabbage leaf, cabbage bought from the supermarket. I made loads and loads of these. However, when my father died in, oh, oopsie. Are you seeing that? Sorry, everyone, about the technicalities. Are you seeing that now? A portrait of my father, photograph of my father?
No.
Okay, hang on. Hang on. I just want to make sure it works. Can you now?
Yes, yeah, we can now.
Excellent, good. Okay, so my father died in 2009 after a 5-year battle with cancer. And then I had absolutely no impulse to make art for a long time, at least 6 months, possibly even a year, looking back. I was completely grief-stricken. And when I started again, I had no interest whatsoever in plants. And I began a new journey. My father's death had released feelings held deeply within my interior world. As if two tectonic plates had opened and released a torrent of magma up to the Earth's surface. That torrent was the grief for my mother, who had died suddenly of pneumonia on holiday in Spain in 1964, our first family holiday abroad. I was 7 years old at the time. And there my mother died in our rented flat, and we buried her there and came home. And here we are at home without the mother. That's my father, me, my brother and sister. The adults around me wanted everything to be okay, for life to return to normal. But looking back, I don't think I had the space to grieve properly. My father never mentioned my mother to me again, and my siblings and I never discussed her. There were no photographs of her on display at home. And I've got another lovely young picture of us all. I buried my mother and the trauma of losing her deep inside me. My father became our mummy daddy. However, my father's death opened those old wounds, and I felt grief-stricken for her too. And I became determined to reinstate her into my life. And this led to a series of drawings which were exhibited in an exhibition called House Clearance that was in London and Leeds. And I'm going to show you a couple of installations. So this is an installation of the drawings in a gallery in Spitalfields, 11 Spitalfields. I'm going to talk about these drawings in a minute, so I'll just skip over these quite quickly, but I did want to show you what they look like in situ in that space. And then this is the same exhibition that travelled to Leeds, to a great gallery called Anne Model in Leeds. And then Judy and I, Judy was sitting with me, collaborated with a psychoanalyst, Caroline Garland, at the Freud Museum in 2018. And many of these drawings were shown there as well. And that exhibition was actually about how creativity helps the mourning process. And that's the central image that we used on most of the publicity. So a drawing by me on the left of my mother's swimming cap, a memory of that, and then one of Judy's wonderful photographs of the skies. And just a quick, not such a great photo, but it shows the installation in the Freud Museum upstairs in fact, Freud's former bedroom. And there's me with some people talking about the work. So, this is a photograph of my house where I grew up, where my dad lived. And the house clearance refers to the job of clearing my father's house, where he lived for 50 years, which had been my childhood home, a 1930s semi-detached house in Shepperton, in London's west suburbs, where we moved in 1959. In 2009, as I began to clear my father's home, I discovered photographs of my mother and documents I'd never seen. And I found her powder compact on my father's writing desk. And I was able to study her face, her clothes, shoes, handbag. And I wanted to touch her. I wanted to bring her back to life. And so I began to get in touch with her through drawing. I'd taken her watch from the apartment where she died, and I'd kept it hidden all those years. So I took it out and drew it. And I drew the powder compact I found. And then I made studies of her face, body, clothes, bag, and shoes from that photograph that I've just shown you. And over time, I began to draw other objects which held personal significance, which I'd found when clearing the house. A lemon that my father had kept on the mantelpiece of the front room where we used to play. I remember this lemon going on the mantelpiece when I was about 12 years old. My mother's copy of Good Housekeeping, which of course we all tried to cook after her death. It was still there in the kitchen drawer. My father's chess set, he was given this in Shanghai where he grew up, and it travelled with him into a Japanese internment camp before coming back to England after the war. And then he played chess with my brother. And I put all these objects in a memory box. I wanted to create my own cabinet of wonders. So place the drawings inside a memory box accompanied by an inventory, a list describing each object briefly in the style of a local house clearance sale. And then I made 2 further memory boxes drawn from memory, where everything is a memory. And then these are some of the drawings from that. My mother's swimming cap memory, memory of her Playtex girdle, a memory of the fan that she used before she died. And then I made another memory box about my father, objects that for me were him, defined him, including a flipper, which he used as a doorstop that my brother used on holiday in Spain when we were young, still there when I cleared the house as a doorstop, covered in dust. And one of his books, this is about crashes and what happens when cars crash, which I used to love looking at on the sofa in his study as a little girl. And this is an example of one of the inventories. And then close up, you can see some of the words. So very, very straightforward, just giving you some information about each object. And then I made, a year later, another memory box, Dead Mother. And I brought the text inside. So this was about my mother, of course. I moved on to start making drawings about the house, but focusing on interior details, which I associated with particular memories of being brought up there. And then little drawings about my father, memories of my father in the home, and things he used to say to me, or TV programs he used to watch. Things he used to do, like he learnt to use the unicycle when he was 60 and juggle at the same time. In 2015, I developed a strong urge to draw a dried up riverbed where I'd walked with my mother in Spain just before she died. But my attempts at drawing failed, and I realised I needed to go back to Alicante to see it again with my own eyes. So later that year, I made my visit, thanks to a Spanish neighbour who helped locate the riverbed, as well as the cemetery, and the apartment where we stayed in El Campello, which is this place here, a nearby fishing village. And there I was able to walk in the riverbed, visit the apartment, and see her grave. And returning, I made a series of drawings. The first 3 riverbed drawings are trying to remember what it must have been like to have heard my father say, "She's died," when everything changes. And then visiting her grave for the first time since I was 7, looking at the ground, and then drawing all the objects, you know, the bits and bobs that I found on the ground, and looking through the keyhole of her grave, and thinking through there she lies, somebody I haven't been in touch with since I was 7. And then I thought about trauma, and what is trauma? Well, it's some sort of collision, and I made a series of drawings where I wanted to sort of feel what it might have been like to have experienced that news that my mother had died. So what are the ideas associated with these works? In her book, Understanding Trauma, Caroline Garland describes trauma as a kind of wound, the piercing of the skin, a breaking of the bodily envelope. The mind is pierced and wounded by events, and some events will overwhelm the capacity of the individual to knock out ordinary functioning and throw the individual into extreme disarray. It extends far beyond the visible, into the depths of the individual's identity. And in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, Van der Kolk believes that arts have the capacity to circumvent the speechlessness that comes with the terror of trauma. The object of writing, he says, is to write to yourself, to let yourself know what you've been trying to avoid. And now I want to look at the role of reparation in the creative process by looking at the theory of reparation developed by Melanie Klein, a psychoanalyst who came to London from Vienna in 1929. Klein focused on the relationship between mother and child. In Klein's work, the baby begins by viewing the mother as 2 extremes, either good or bad, depending on the baby's frustration with her, when it's hungry, thirsty, tired, uncomfortable. This extreme position is replaced by a stage when the baby shows concern for the mother and develops a desire to preserve her from its aggression. The baby wants to build a good relationship with the mother, and at this stage is called reparation. And reparation is a genuine expression of love for the mother. This process of reparation has been examined by Hannah Siegel, a psychoanalyst who followed Klein. She believed that the creative process is creative labour. In her book, Dream, Fantasy and Art, she writes that artists are working at trying to mend something deep in our internal worlds. And for me, this means mourning and reconstructing my absent mother through the act of drawing. And returning to the memory boxes, I want to mention Sherry Turkle, psychologist at MIT. Her book, Evocative Objects, considers objects as companions to our emotional lives, or as provocations to thought. The personal belonging is our companion through life. It provokes memories. It can be charged with emotion. And Daniel Miller, anthropologist at UCL, in his book Stuff, suggests that objects not only represent but create us. Our houses with our stuff, our autobiographies. In homes, people create themselves through stuff. We're able to see ourselves in this extension of ourselves. we can come to understand who we are. Miller believes that moving house becomes a means to reshuffle relationships and memories by bringing them back into consciousness, by making them explicit, and for deciding which ones to reinforce, which ones to abandon or put on hold. The paring down of objects transforms the memory into a more idealized one. He says we can't control the date when our loved ones die, but we can control how and when we separate from the personal objects associated with those we've lost. Christopher Bolus, a Freudian psychoanalyst, in his book, The Evocative Object World, describes the objects experienced during childhood as containing parts of the self's experience that will have been projected into the objects as memory containers of lived experience. The importance of an object as an emotional companion can be traced back to the baby's transitional object, as defined by the psychologist Donald Winnicott. When the baby is born, it thinks mother and baby are one, but gradually as the baby grows, it starts to realize that mother is a separate person. At this stage, the baby becomes attached to an object, perhaps a teddy bear or a small cloth, which its state of mind understands to be part baby, part mother, and part the external world. Its familiarity becomes a comfort to the child. And what are the photographs I found of my mother? These small black and white portraits, photos of her playing with me and my brother, and others showing her sitting with her family. These are my evidence that she existed in my life. In Camera Lucida, Roland Barthes suggests that photographs are the memory, can take the place of memory, or recreate ideas of the past through the present. For each memory box, I place my drawings inside shallow vitrines, containers where memories are ordered, edited, categorized, kept under wraps, and preserved, hinting at the museum display or archaeological find, reinforced by the inventory caption displayed alongside. The memory boxes are my equivalent of those historic cabinets of curiosity, cabinets which contained art, archaeology, and natural history, assembled by collectors after their grand tours. But my wonder boxes tell stories about my personal life. Stephen Gross, in his book, The Examined Life, writes that our childhoods leave stories in us that we find a way to voice in the form of words or other means, either consciously or unconsciously. The French philosopher Gaston Bachelard, in his book, The Poetics of Space, believes the house provokes our desires, memories, and fantasies, and these live beyond the physical boundaries of that space. Narratives proliferate in multiple layers. In the house where I grew up, the past is present in each room, on the staircase banister, the window ledges and door handles, in the silence, in the smell of each space. Finally, in his essay, Mourning and Melancholia, Freud writes that when we mourn a loved person who's been lost, we withdraw the emotional attachment we placed on this person and bring it inside ourselves, onto our egos. In other words, we internalize those people we've lost. Perhaps there are elements of my drawing that are my internalized mother. And I'm going to end with two drawings. This is a portrait of my mother I made just after I came back from Alicante. It's obviously very different to the first drawing I'd made from the photograph, but this is the essence of my mother, and this is the truest portrait I have of her. And finally, a collection of Bakelite plugs I took from the house and then drew. And I found this drawing very, very difficult to do. And it reminded me so much of the wretchedness of being home without my mother, and how awful that time was. So I've called this drawing Motherless. So I'm going to stop presenting, and I just want to, before I leave you, just mention to me what those creative tips that Carly mentioned. So for me, what they would be, follow your obsessions, whatever they are, just follow them. Keep a journal. I've got mine here. It's just when I say journal, it sounds rather grand, but it's anything and everything that I want to make a note of, because this is the way I learn about myself. I love this quote, "Make bad art." Sol LeWitt told Eva Hess when she kept having blocks, just to make bad art. And I think that's so true. You know, don't be a critic of your own work. Just do it. Don't be harsh. And try and look for connections. Use each work to find out about yourself. Speak to yourself. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Faye. I'm just uploading your presentation now, Ellie.
Okay, so while it goes up, I just want to say hi to everyone. I'm Ellie. I actually did take up my PhD at the School of Arts in Birkbeck. And I'm really pleased to be here today and absolutely thrilled to be collaborating with Faye and Judy and Carly again. So thank you, Carly, for taking over the presentation. I'll just say next slide. In fact, we can just go to the second slide right away. So Faye and Judy recently gave a talk through the University of Leicester on mediating personal practices through personal experiences through artistic practices. And the symposium happened to fall on a day when I had 4 up to 6 contractors at home at some point dealing simultaneously with plumbing and electrical and boiler emergencies, so that when I joined the online talk, we were all sharing the same space. I worked from my kitchen, and I assumed nobody was really listening because there were so many things going on, but as kind of the minutes ticked by, I could see that some of them were really affected by the what they were hearing. So we were hearing stories of loss and remembrance and grief, and the seeming senselessness of living in the arbitrary nature of the world and all that it brings you. And sometimes you're not prepared to deal with it. So later we got chatting, and some of them said that they had not known that there were ways outside of conventional therapy of addressing personal pain, of reconstituting your sadness and then releasing it. And in so doing, creating something that's beautiful, I mean, for yourself. Something that you make yourself that you can always turn back to when you need the comfort. And I thought that was really moving. I'm not an artist, I'm an economist, and I work in the field of human development. And as Carly said, I do specialize in issues related to gender and public policy, lots of feminist economics and the care economy, doing lots of taxation work. But it seems to me, you know, every project that I take on is that we generally tend to look at the human experience from a different angle. So we try to correct for disjointed realities by using data or information. It's an appeal to logic. And in that way, we try to direct the flow of resources or of interest to whatever area of concern we've got. And we might appeal to ideals such as equality and fairness to enforce commitments made at the political level. We do not appeal to our common humanity as often as we should, because we rarely consider what it means to be. And sometimes when we go through human development, we look at these indicators, and these indicators track how humans become. So access to education or access to healthcare, a right to a life free of violence as well. But this doesn't always tell us about how people engage with the world and flourish in the world. And a lot of the time that has to do because we do programming on a simplified matrix of possibilities. So on the one hand, you have victims, and then through a combination of policy and money and capacity building, you're turning people into empowered agents without truly considering how the potential for them to become actually comes from. So there's almost never a consideration of the self in policy work, or how people pull themselves together again after trauma. And so for this reason, I'm referring today to psychoanalytic theory and philosophies that suggest that who we are and how we come to be is a synthesis of the self. So that's mind and body, and of the relation of the self as it relates to itself, as much as it relates to the world around us. So people think that psychoanalytic theory and philosophy are incompatible, but both in their own ways deal with the processes of becoming, and both influence artistic practice. Next slide, please. So that's how I come to be here today. I'm also a philosopher, and maybe that's for my own understanding of the world and of its people, but I find that art and that process of making it and mediating our experiences through painting or writing or photography or storytelling really does offer us something. So I want to begin with the myth of Psyche and Cupid. He's also known as Eros, and I have to say that some of the reading includes references to suicide. So the myth is often cited as a reminder that courage and determination release us from limiting beliefs, negative mindsets, or any influence that no longer serves us. But I think there's more to it than that. It also illustrates the development of consciousness and of our soul's journey to becoming. So in Greek, Psyche is soul. And in some versions of the story, and this is from the 2nd century Latin writer called Apuleius, Psyche is a very beautiful daughter of a king. And she comes to be revered as a deity, and that's a divine honor that's traditionally reserved for the goddess Aphrodite, who happens to be Cupid's mother. So Aphrodite seeks revenge, and she decrees that Psyche will never marry. And Psyche's father notices that she has no suitor, so he goes to Apollo's oracle at Delphi, and unbeknownst to him, Aphrodite has already conspired with the oracle, who declares that Psyche has to marry Death, or the equivalent version of the most vile creature that they could come up with. So he chains his daughter to a rock and leaves her there to be ravaged by whatever spirit is sent up to claim her. So at the outset, Psyche's power and agency, they're not her own, but they're first her father's, and then by extension of the cultural, the social, the religious, and all the familial bonds that make up all the institutional arrangements that shape but also delimit the ways in which we can take up our own sense of self. So the bonds of family and kinship for Psyche have been broken. Now, she's not condemned to die, but her punishment is fate worse than death, because it's a way of burdening her and of obstructing her ability to step into that becoming by making her live a life that's been determined by other people. Now, myth says Aphrodite instructs her son to wound Psyche with one of his arrows. So on top of it all, she has to be induced to love this creature, and fate intervenes. He sees her, he is overcome by her beauty, and he accidentally pierces himself with one of his arrows. He falls in love with her, he rescues her, and they live in bliss. And the one condition that he has is that she will never try to find out who he is, and she has to accept her life as he presents it to her. So they live like this for a very short while, because then Psyche's sisters come to visit, and they're really jealous, and they plant doubt in her mind, and they say Cupid must be a monster, otherwise why would he hide himself from you? So she waits for him for Cupid to sleep, and she approaches the bed, and she's got an oil lamp in one hand and a knife in the other in case he is a monster. And as his face is illuminated, she's overcome by his beauty. So she steps back, falls into a pile of arrows, so she's accidentally pierced herself now. But in the meantime, he wakes up because a bit of oil has dropped on his shoulder, and she's flailing about and she's holding the knife, so he thinks she means to kill him, so he flees to his mother. So in the meantime, she's overcome by grief and by the loss of love, so she pleads with the gods to help her. So even gods are afraid of the old ways, and they're not going to help a mortal that has angered one of their own. So she decides to take matters into her own hands, and she visits Aphrodite, who gives her 4 tasks to do. So at this point, commentators liken Psyche's appeal to Aphrodite as a moment where she's taking up agency to change her life. And the tasks are meant to symbolize the processes through which we shed fear and doubt and negative beliefs. But Aphrodite's tasks are designed to temper Psyche's spirit, and they are so daunting that Psyche contemplates dying. Can we change slides? So this is what the existentialist philosophers say about suicide, but there's more to it So we're going to come back to that, because philosophy has a way of delving right into the darkness, into the why the act of self-destruction can be so compelling for those who are in the grips of trauma. Change slide, please. So self-destruction is an attempt to master rationality and self-recognition in a world that has lost meaning. Self-destruction is set as a natural course of action, for there is no satisfaction, no point of appeasement that will stop this drive towards catastrophe, this trauma. And it's the deepest and broadest affirmation of the overpowering. So this is one way of understanding Psyche, for whom meaning and kinship and friendship and love have all been lost. So in the grips of trauma, Psyche becomes burdened by the weight of despair and powerlessness. And despite the fact that she has already confronted that ultimate frontier, which we as humans see as death, because we are confronted by our own finitude. And she's done that, it's symbolized by her journey across the river Styx. Despite all of this, she gives in to fitful sleep in the underworld. And she has not died. Can you change slides, please? She is in a sleep state, which is called the poiesis, and that's the state that brings forth something that did not exist before, her own self. So she has actually changed. The world around her has remained exactly as it's always been. She doesn't realize it. So she's lulled by the apparent familiarity of the world as it is presented to her by others, and she slowly drifts into alienation. Next slide. So Sartre and Camus write to exemplify the anguish, the alienation, the relinquishment. This is the triad of existentialism, to allude to the encroachment of situations upon spiritual and intellectual freedom as the physical experience of the full weight of life upon consciousness. So what they're saying is this: should the conflict between our own relative insignificance and the incomprehensibility of the world, should this conflict lead to self-destruction, then suicide under these conditions cannot be considered a judgment against life or an abrogation of the moral law. So that's important, because they're not saying that suicide is a sin, and they're not judging your dark thoughts as some sort of weakness or moral flaw. What they're saying is that suicide is an abrogation of our critical faculties, and yet this is no mere madness. This is coming from a place of intranquility. Next slide. So Seneca's words are rather shocking, but they're meant for us to consider the value of living despite trauma, and this opens up the space for creating meaning from within. So that's a lot to come to terms with. Fundamentally, what some philosophers want us to understand is that we're in the world, and as such, bodies are the conditions of constraint, but embodied beings represent the conditions of possibility. Next slide. So my consciousness and my imagination are free, but as I am in the world, these are weighed down by two things: facticity, which is the things about me that I can't change, and my situations, how I come to be in the world. And tying my consciousness to the world, that's what a situation does, tying my consciousness to the world I embody, but it's also the starting point for change. So if we think about Psyche, who finds herself in situations where she is coerced, she is deceived, but she's also helped and redeemed through others. So she's eventually saved by Cupid, who, sensing that she is in danger, he flies down to the underworld and he wakes her. Next slide. So how can we come to know when we are in the grips of conflict, in this place of intranquility? So the existentialists believe that conflict is an important component of all human relationships, because freedom, and there is no absolutes, you can never reach absolute freedom. We all have ties to this world, we have families, we have work commitments. So freedom is always set against a background of constraints, and we grow through struggle. And he likens the project of being to a long walk that's fraught with resistance and with fear. And this is better appreciated in his 1938 novel Nausea, Carly, I think the PowerPoint went off. I'm looking at Judy's.
Sorry.
Yes,
Yeah, it disappeared. I'll have to bring it back. Bear with me.
We're still on nausea. And nausea is actually often manifested as disgust, when we retch, when we see something that's disgusting, a disgust trigger, waste or feces, also an act of violence. But it isn't just physical. Nausea triggers feelings of dread, of anguish, of despair. And once on this trajectory, the body, it can live by itself, absolutely. But it's a body that is mechanical, it's weary, it's attended by an enfeebled will. And yeah, I think if you just go to the slide, that's fine. It's attended by an enfeebled will, and it's fueled by the onset of a lowness of feeling, a strangeness or an anxiety. Next slide. So philosophy aims to create awareness of how we live and why. And the degree to which bodies are naturalized and acculturated is a taught modality of thought and of action that finds presence in the contingency of being. And it is this unavoidable contingency of being that is misaligned with what others presume our abilities, our thinking, or our desires ought to be. So we see that in discriminatory practices against particular modalities of identity, such as racism or sexism. So in what other ways might we know that the psyche is in conflict? Well, psychoanalysis provides a wonderful framework for how humans become by charting the physical and the psychical manifestations of what philosophers call this lowness of feeling. And this last slide, Carly. So Sigmund Freud suggests that within the psyche there resides a configuration of dominance and disempowerment, and that becomes more pronounced or more imbalanced if an individual experiences trauma. So in psychoanalysis, trauma is an emotional response to a devastating life event, which manifests in the sufferer as a breach of his or her bodily integrity that's brought on by a fragmentation of the mind, and this in turn hinders the ability of the body to be in the world in the fullness of its being. So in fact, it's a mind-body event, and we don't have time to discuss Descartes, but the fundamental and often controversial assumption, even in psychoanalysis, is that the mind and body represent together what we can know and experience in this lifetime. So this fragmentation of the mind triggers feelings of being divided or being partial. This triggers a form of mourning, because for the sufferer, the body's wholeness proves to be illusory. And this matters too because we're social creatures. So when we lose the ability to be or to trust in a world that we can't comprehend, this integrity is ruptured. Next slide. Actually, that was Descartes, so that was the last one. Let's just go back to one. And so Jacques Lacan developed Freud's theories, and he observed that the manner in which others see us, in the manner and ability through which we are able to project ourselves outwardly, further contributes to this consciousness of wholeness. Others, be it family or community or even a citizen within the body politic. We need to see ourselves in a whole, and this is where we thrive. So we must know we can access security through this bodily integrity, which assures us that we're able to pull ourselves together in mind and in body in the event of trauma. So this loss of integrity, this disharmony can be mended. There's many studies that have been done, mended through the shared experiences of trauma. And these experiences, of course, can be mediated through art, which offers us a way of voicing and of materializing our pain, our shame, or our remorse. Sometimes when we see another's pain, we might recognize our own. And I'll leave it there, but if it's one thing you notice about this presentation, I'm really great at intellectualizing trauma, but one of the reasons why I enjoy speaking with Carly and Faye and Judy is that I still haven't learned to do that myself, how to take what's in my head and make something of it, just pour all that out. So I hope that this talk today helps all of you. And if you have further questions, I guess we'll see each other at the chat later on. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ellie. Okay, Judy, your presentation is up.
Right. Hi. This talk is about my father, who died in 1955, aged 34. My excavation of his life and its impact on me. This has been the focus of my work in recent years. This is the only photograph I have of us together. Shortly after this, he was admitted to hospital, never to return. My father died in the last pandemic to hit the world, that of polio. I can't make it work.
Don't worry. Sorry, just having a technical hitch. We're on to the next one. Yeah.
He died in one of these missions when I was 1. I will be talking about mourning as a creative process and how inventing rites of mourning that are pictorial and which figure their own scenes and spaces of mourning are quite different than the established ones. Illumination and its absence plays its part. Harold Ellery escaped Nazi Germany and settled in England, where he served in the British Army, trained as an architect, and died of polio after spending 3 months encased in an iron lung. My understanding of him has been a drip feed of memory from my mother. As I was so young when he died, I never knew any other way of life, and my mother found it extremely painful to talk about him, having only been married for 5 short and wonderful years. I was very aware that I did not want to upset her. She brought up my sister Debbie and I as happy, well-rounded children, and we had a perfectly contented childhood. Strangely, I'm still trying to comprehend why it was in my adult life that I began to respond to the trauma of my father's death and absence. What took me so long? Is this part of the grieving process? I'm wondering if it was taking on my mother's narrative that it did not occur to me to think of my own subjective account of his loss. My journey of grieving began serendipitously by random events, which enabled me to connect with him through objects, ephemera, and touch. My uncle gave me his military jacket, my mother his silver cigarette box. My Israeli cousin, clearing out his father's belongings, gave me some typed copies of some schoolboy poems that my father had written aged 8. In blissful ignorance of the horrors that would soon unravel in Germany. The bundle of documents my cousin gave me were a tangible link to my father's past and his boyish pranks. They breathed life into a body of fragmented memory and inspired in me the desire to collate the fragments of documents I had to make and to make an artist book. This was my first material processing of a connection to Harold, a kind of archaeology, and one that simultaneously inspired my creativity. This was the book Carbon Copy, is made up of a medley of photographically transformed fragments of my father's life, typed and written. These were carbon copies of long forgotten schoolboy poems from 1929 in German, bundled together with an illustrated Hebrew text, as well as his signature on a letter from the architectural practice he was tragically never able to join. The blue of the carbon not only reminded me of the way past generations duplicate, but were reminiscent of the carbon compounds which form the basis of all known life on Earth. This living material connects us to the basic elements of the universe, to stardust and to our own physicality. These documents pricked my curiosity about him, and at last I wanted to find out more. Despite the echoing silence or my mother's inability to remember, I tracked down some of my father's documents held in the National Archive at Kew with the help of my stepbrother Peter, an enthusiastic genealogist. This was a truly profound experience, an awakening from the vast shelves of the archive to find documents of his naturalization, letters of recommendation from the Architectural Association and from the architectural practice he never lived to work for. It was a kind of mausoleum to my father. Opening the red perspex box, as seen here, at the archive to find the documents I'd ordered up was the start of this investigation, and I couldn't quite believe the paper trail that I was about to discover. It was such an intoxicating physical experience discovering these documents that had been lying dormant and probably unlooked at for decades. Vital pieces of paper that for my father to be granted a smooth entry as an immigrant into this country and for his future life. These unexpected files contained handwritten, crossed out, annotated index cards, compressed information about my father's formal identities. They became crucial to my understanding of his transformation from German schoolboy through to English adult via type, inks, marks, stamps, and deletions in red and black. These were the official national colours of the Weimar Republic into which he was born. His palimpsest history was displayed on a single card. 14 years ago, I was writing my dissertation for my master's at Central St Martin's, and I chose to base it on the only house that my architect father had designed for a client. It was the one house he had worked on in his career. In fact, I had only recently discovered that he'd even built a house. And even worse, as I started to research for my dissertation, I discovered to my horror that it had been demolished. At that time, I was having building work done on my own house. As I watched the wind suck the giant tarpaulins in and out of the building site, I felt that I was witnessing a tempest. The elements were wild, and the sun raged through the wind and clouds. It was mesmeric. I read this as a force of nature, as a metaphor for the breath of life that united my father and me. As a result, I produced a series of images from this significant events, which I called Neshama, which means the Hebrew for soul. In this group of photographs, I was concerned with the intersection of familial identity figured in terms as a fabric of an unfinished house. The chamber formed by the open room in the photographs is filled with the wind, filling the tarpaulins like clouds. What this concept denotes is the divine breath with an infinite capacity to bring with it transcendence. I've always been mesmerized by fabric, billowing fabric, stemming from my mother's extensive shopping line, maybe. She had remarried and at this time had acquired 5 additional children into the fold, and I was often allowed to help her gather it all in. As it happens, my whole family obsessed with washing and hanging it in an orderly manner on the washing line. I witnessed that only today as I was with my daughter Scarlett. It was on holiday, when I was on holiday in Mallorca, that I saw some white curtains being blown in extreme wind around some sun lounges, that I found myself compelled to film this phenomena. Through the process of layering both imaginary imagery and sounds, I produced the short film Pneuma, which is Greek for breath, which I'll now show you, hopefully. I overlaid x-rays of my own chest over the veils of fabric, producing a shroud like ethereal phenomena, and amplified the strange knocking sound that I found. Was it the burial shroud that I was referring to of my father? The desire to continue my compulsion with the idea of breath led me to revisit the images that I took of Neshama and reconfigure them in another artist's book, Spiration. Playing with the ideas of the dampness of breath, I ended up making a spiral of interconnected images, using gloss on one of the surfaces, contrasting with the matte surface on the other, echoing the feeling of moisture on the exhale in breath. The spiral folds into itself, from the fold of our material selves, our bodies, to the folding of time, or simply memory, an interiority and exteriority. It's a recurring theme that I keep coming back to, a connection to my father's inability to breathe. I asked my mother about my father's activities in the war, but she could not remember much about this topic. It was such a long time ago, and she reiterated that no one wanted to look back or to talk about their wartime experiences. But she suddenly produced a tightly bound file of correspondence containing every letter my father had written to his father, Carl, during the war. I had never heard of or knew about this file's existence. His father, Carl, had emigrated to Palestine and settled in Tel Aviv. And this file, an extraordinary gift from the past, gave me an astonishing insight into my father through his weekly aerograms, describing his military postings in Belgium, Holland, London, Cairo, and Alexandria, all conversational and written in black cursive script. To my amazement, the letters gave me a welcome glimpse into his army life, his longing for a good Jewish marriage, Sabbath gatherings, the boredom and horror of the Second World War. He even wrote briefly of his experience of being a British officer at the eventual liberation of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. But this is somehow glossed over. Too painful, I suppose, to describe and impossible for him to write about. I was thrilled to learn of his passion for photography and his Leica in particular. This was the very same make of camera that I was to learn my craft on. I photographed the letter's edge on to replicate the layers, the strata of accumulating time, another archaeological find. In 2018, my installation in the domestic space of Freud's house, Breathe, meditated on the themes of breath and time, incorporating several strands. They are a symbol for this man, my father, latterly fighting for oxygen, as I tried to connect with him through photographs, with his body, his being, through film and the portal of the iron lung. Throughout my life, I had heard that Harold had died in an iron lung, but strangely, I was never curious to find out more. The thought of it, the very sound of the name, filled me with horror. But somehow this time it was different. My brother David put me in touch with a colleague of his who had a passion for restoring old medical equipment and, amazingly, had rebuilt an iron lung. Filled with curiosity, I went to the Royal Orthopaedic Hospital in Stanmore, where it was housed in an old leaky shed in one of the outbuildings. I was compelled to climb in it, to somehow reconnect with the experience that my father had endured for 3 months. I tried to defy the machine in my breathing, but it takes you over, as it was designed to do, and I found myself comfortably and gently being breathed. I photographed myself, as you can see here, reflected in the mirror, placed at the top of the iron lung, to try and insert myself somehow into the machinery, to somehow connect to my father. But I was only partially happy with the imagery that I got. I recontacted Rick, the anaesthetist, and asked if I could come back to photograph the iron lung again. Surprisingly, it had been rescued from the scrap heap where it was destined and stored safely in a horse box belonging to a friend of his on her farm. Despite being squeezed into this unlikely housing, the new location for the machine was photographically just what I had wanted to take. Next. My current work focuses on astronomy, observatories, scientists, and the machines for looking. Photographing the night skies and the machines that image the past and show light from millions of years past, somehow telescoping time. Equipment continues to compel my work, and machines that make the invisible visible. The machinery of looking, the massive telescopes and observatories that allow us to look beyond this earth, beyond the edges of perception, looking to the heavens for the unknown. But how does this work connect to my father? Maybe it is the mysterious nature of what I'm looking at, something you can't ever know. It's just not as clear as the night sky. The curator of our exhibition, Caroline Garland, commented that maybe I'm as occupied with the equipment for seeing as I am with the mysterious nature of what it is that equipment sees. The mystery is part of the answer. Where is he? Where is she? Where does the lost person go when they can no longer be found in the world? It might just be possible to find them in outer space, perhaps the modern version of what some called heaven, as to find them in the relics of an earthly and domestic engagement with the world. And that's where I wanted to end my presentation. And following Carly's requests for prompts, I would say take photographs of everything that you want to, that you feel attracted to, and don't question the impulse. Sometimes I feel I just have to photograph something and I don't know why. And there's that saying that people often ask me about a camera and they say, what camera is the best that you can have? And if the answer is the camera that you have on you, and increasingly and continuously, it's our iPhones, which are pretty great, or the phone that you happen to have. Collect material that may be relevant to you and maybe put it in files or categories, and then you might find a pattern that emerges from what you're interested in. And I'm very keen on making up books of thoughts and ideas that might relate to each other. I think the physicality of a photograph or a book is far more engaging and exciting than looking at it on screen. And as Faye says, keep a notebook, a sketchbook. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy. Thank you. Okay, now we've got some time for questions, comments. If anybody has anything they want to say, you can either type it in the chat or unmute yourself and ask us. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Francesca. I mean, feel free to chip in with any comments as well, if there's anything that brought up for you guys. I think one of the things that came out of it for me that that resonated through all of our individual talks was like the notion of fragments, like Faye with your fragments of the house and just fragments of being, like Judy, you're trying to find your dad in the carbon of the letters, and that for me really resonated with like how I process things is through fragments, you know, and when I'm writing, my mind's going all over the place, and that's why I think that really helps sometimes, is to just go with it, you know, and because your thoughts aren't linear and they're not always following a nice steady pattern, and that's why like writing like that really helps me when I'm writing like free writing or journaling. I'm going by fragments of what's popping into my mind at that time. So yeah, I think it's really important just not to criticize yourself too much, like you said, and just just go with what you're feeling, and it really helps, you know, just to process difficult things and whatever you're struggling with at that particular moment. Thank you, Jeremy. Oh yeah, Dan. Dan does have an obsession with photographing corridors.
I get that. I did too. When I've had my artist residencies in the offices, I photographed all the corridors. I completely understand it. But whoever suggested that, do you go into any of the rooms that the corridors are off? Because corridors are endlessly, fantastically interesting.
Yeah. And it's almost like what you're gonna see in your photograph that you don't see at that moment. That's what Dan thinks anyway. Like, take a picture of the corridor, and it's either in buildings or like tree-lined corridors, where, you know, like nature reserves kind of thing. And then it's looking back at those photographs afterwards and thinking, did I see that at the time, or am I only seeing this because of what is picked up in this photograph? And I like that kind of layering of effect of visualizing things and thinking about things. Thank you everybody for your lovely comments. Jeremy, yes, please unmute yourself.
Well, first of all, thank you. I mean, thank you for those astonishing, beautiful presentations. What I wanted to ask, and I don't want to make this too personal, but it seems to me that everybody who's presented today has an extraordinary gift of some kind. That might be writing, it might be drawing, it might be photography. What do you say to those of us who feel that we lack the capacity for creative work in that way? And like I say, don't want to make it too personal, but you know, sometimes if you encounter grief or trauma or whatever you experience in your life, if you try to respond to it artistically and all you get out of it is a sense of frustration and annoyance, and then a sort of sense that, oh my God, have I really got nothing to articulate about this? It can be, it seems to me, counterproductive. So presumably you need a kind of baseline of capacity and skill that you can start to convert into the creative output that you've described. Like I say, don't make it too personal.
I don't know, that, I mean, that's why I said in that in my talk, art is for everybody. You don't need to have a niche. Like mine is writing. I just write because that's the medium that I find most useful. But also I think it's about navigating through various different mediums to find what is most comfortable for you. And like Faye says, make bad art. It doesn't matter what it is. What it is. It's not about the product. It's not about making something beautiful or saying I have artistic skill in this medium, so I can produce this. It doesn't matter. It's about, well, for me anyway, it's about the process. It's about, you know, working through it, no matter what kind of medium you're working in. You go, Faye.
Yeah, it's a really great question, Jeremy. I would say leave technique and skill to the side at the moment. You know, just try and if you want to draw something, paint something, write something, just do it. And try not to be frustrated. Try not to think about technique. I think that's and skill. Don't get hung up about that. You can always learn technique and skill. You can go to endless evening classes, day classes, and learn. I promise, I did. I think for me, the most important thing is find, I mean, it's a bit corny and it's a cliche, but, you know, find your own language, find your own obsessions. It might be that, you know, what you want to do is just make a mess, but the mess becomes your way of making art, and that's what it's about. And what's the, you know, and then you sort of have to think about, well, what is mess, and why am I making mess, and all that sort of stuff. You just have to go on the journey. Everyone can learn technique and skill, I promise. It's not rocket science. It's, you just go to an evening class. I really mean that. I mean, it's hard work, of course, but you know, we're all capable of it. I really believe that.
It's also about you being very judgmental. What is that voice that's saying it's, you know, I mean, we all have that voice in us all the time saying you're rubbish, or what you're doing is invalid, or why are you doing that, or start again, or, you know, it is that constant little nag at the back of your head. And I think it's also about kind of diminishing that voice and ploughing on. I mean, who are we to judge? I mean, I think a lot of I was talking about is, you know, who knows? You don't know. It's all the mystery of making art. I mean, or what we're doing. It's a complex process. There's no right or wrong. I mean, that's the other thing, don't you think?
Definitely.
I sympathize with Jeremy. I think it's really hard. I completely agree with what Jeremy's saying, and not with what Faye and Judy are saying. It's really hard. And I think for me, it's really scary. It's all. I mean, I look at Carly's journal prompts and I just go, no, I can't do this. I can't. And I would just say is at some point you have to. And that's the thing. At some point, it's not a question, it's not a choice. It's something that you got to do it. And once you just think this is just like washing the dishes or taking the dog out, for my own well-being, it's something that you have to do. And it takes a long time. I'm certainly not there yet, but slowly, I bought my notebook. I'm thinking about it. Hopefully, I can start doing it too.
Okay, buy a notebook in the morning.
Yes, Jeremy, do it. Oh, thank you so much, everybody. We are at time now. I'm going to post a little thing in the chat there. So thank you, everybody, for joining us for Arts Week. So do join us for more free talks, readings, screenings and performances until the 21st of May. The link to browse and book is now in the chat and will be emailed around after the event. After the event, you'll also receive a feedback form, so please do fill those in. It gives us lots of information with which to plan future art weeks. Thank you very much to all of my wonderful speakers. You've done a marvellous job, and we did it with the technology. Well done, everybody. And thank you everyone who's attended. It's really nice.
Thank you.
We haven't seen your faces, but we've seen you all lined up down the bottom. Thank you so much. Oh, lovely comments.
Yes, let me leave.
Thank you, Carly. Good luck.
Thank you, my love. Speak to you later.
Yeah.